Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. Today, we're going to talk about the very important topic of data privacy. Data privacy, not only as a concept, but also the implications of where data privacy regulations and rules and requirements are going across the world. I'm joined by two guests today, Ashish and Constantine. So, Ashish Shrowty from Divebell, do you want to maybe introduce yourself first, and then we'll have Constantine introduce himself?
Sure thing, Tim. Thanks for inviting us here. Glad to be here. It's fantastic. Just from a background standpoint, I have close to about 25 plus years in technology, trained as an engineer, but over the years have been closer and closer, getting closer to data and use of data. So background in building products and teams, majority for regulated industries like finance and healthcare, have held leadership positions in Fortune 100 companies, led things like information lifecycle management programs, data science programs, building data analytics capabilities, and very recently also was doing data engineering and machine learning at a retail loyalty marketing company, and through which being close to data came across this very important and relevant topic to the day of data privacy and data security, and noticed that there's some very interesting leverage that technology can bring to this field, this whole burgeoning field, and it's just getting started. And I'm sure Constantine's going to disagree with getting started, but I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of interesting discussion. So happy to be here and looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Ashish. And Constantine Karbaliotis, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction and for getting my name correctly. Thank you. And so my byline is I was doing data privacy before it was cool. I've been in privacy for 19 years now. I'm an Ontario called lawyer based in Toronto. But most of my experience has been multinational. I have been responsible for running Symantec's global privacy program. I was a chief privacy officer at Mercer, and I've been dealing with US and EU data privacy issues throughout that period of time and to today. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Excellent. And Constantine, why don't you start off? So maybe give a little bit of what's happening in data privacy in the world. And I know that's a massively wide topic, but some interesting things maybe you want to call out for folks.
Well, the first thing, and unless you've been under a rock, you've probably heard of the European General Data Protection Regulation. And that was, I would say, the most important privacy law on the planet to date. It has set the tone really internationally for where countries are going with their laws. And really, the best way I think to explain it to your audience is that it's a little bit misnamed because really it's an information governance law. One would have expected that companies would be able to tell somebody what they know about you. They would be able to tell you where the data is, how it's flowing, and yet still that's not really, it seems, possible. So this is why it's been a big lift for a lot of companies, is that they finally had to get their act together to be able to respond to the legal requirements. You notice there's no word inventory in GDPR, but in order to do most of the things that are required by that law, you actually have to know where your data is. So it's really set the tone, and of course in the US, you see the impacts through state legislation like California's, Consumer Privacy Protection Act, through, increasing number of laws around the United States at the state level, and also a change in consumer appetite. There is no question that the spam we all received in 2018 saying, can keep writing to you, for GDPR, educated the whole planet in a way that privacy professionals have never been able to, because of course it would have been against the law, and that the consumer expectations are as much a driver now as the laws are. So California, GDPR, Canada is also looking at updating its law. Quebec last week passed a very GDPR-like law. So Brazil, LGPD, around the globe, countries are raising their game because why? They want to be able to do business with Europe. And that's been a key driver for a lot of these changes. But again, that education, those expectations that the Europeans inadvertently passed around the globe have really caused legislative action. So that in a nutshell is where we are today. And we are looking only at more and increasing levels of regulation and privacy.
You've touched on the one of the key aspects of this, which is the change from a very corporate centric view of data to an individual centric view of data or a consumer centric view of data. Is I mean, I certainly agree with that concept, but is that causing, how is that causing difficulties for the different corporations and areas like that?
Well, the principal problem, as I mentioned before, if you don't know where your data is and what it is, it's very hard to respond to, for instance, an individual's subject access request or data subject access request. What do I know about John Doe or Johann Schmidt or whoever around the globe? When they, as they're entitled to under many laws, ask and say, what do you know about me? Could you not sell it? Could you please delete it? Those fundamental things, because our information governance has been so poor, have been difficult for companies to implement. Um, and of course, if you do any of the other things that you have to do under laws, for instance, in Europe, you're required to have a record of processing activities. Well, if you have to be able to associate the processing with a business process, even that seems to be challenging. Well, again, because systems get built, the people who built it left, we don't have any documentation, things just sort of grow, haphazardly through the organization, and then we have spaghetti. We're trying to figure out how things thread together. So these are, fundamentals now, and when companies um, sought to comply with GDPR, for example, but didn't think about doing it in the US, then they got surprised and said, "Well, we should have known better because California's law came along and required almost exactly the same kind of capabilities." So those are the real challenges, and for many businesses who are now um, tied to big companies, trying to do business with them, well, those expectations are getting passed down by contract. You are not going to get me into trouble. You have to make sure that you've got the right mechanisms in your organization so that I can count on that, because the supply chain is really how it's percolating out. And that's a profound change now for organizations. Before it was just compliance. Nobody wants to spend money on compliance. Well, the Europeans know that, and that's why they made it the fines as big as they are, 4% of global revenue. But when revenue is now at stake, companies are paying attention.
Absolutely. It's a key aspect. I think you also touched on a really important part of it, which is that it's an nth party problem. It's a full supply chain problem, right? And with the proliferation of cloud technologies and capabilities, right, that's a blessing, and in some cases a data governance curse. How are you going to manage those things?
Exactly. And recently, we can't neglect the results of some European Court of Justice decisions, which invalidated the Privacy Shield and which have caused companies to now have to rely, first of all, on standard contractual clauses, which, by the way, just changed again, to recognize these decisions, which have to address now transfer risk. Is the protection adequate in the country that you're sending the data to? What is the likelihood that it might be, for instance, used or accessed under national security laws? These are all driving a very, very powerful, message to organizations. You have to understand what your data is and how it's moving, whom you're entrusting it to.
We've talked about a lot of different things, and I know that it's such a fast evolution that's been happening in there. But what do you feel is happening in the next year to 18 months? Where do you see things happening from that side?
Well, it's always entertaining to, as your neighbors to the north, watch the United States because it's a fascinating place to start with. And you have these state laws developing. So a lot of the activity and the action is at the state level. And the question is, where is the critical mass? How many states have to pass laws representing what proportion of the population before the federal government passes a federal law? Which is what many of the big techs have been actually lobbying for because they'd love to avoid the patchwork situation. These are all, similar but not identical in, consequence and in, application. So that makes it more challenging, for organizations. But there are certain fundamentals, right? You'll have to be able to, again, understand your data flow, be able to put your hands on particular individuals. So that's going to be probably one of the more interesting things to watch. There's also a lot of hope, pressure to reestablish that a privacy shield version 2. We'll see if that happens. There has been some ups and downs in the US EU relationship as of late, so there isn't any certainty in that area. But we do know basically what I think is coming at us around the globe in terms of expectations. And like I said at the beginning, GDPR has set the tone. And that's really the gold standard organizations have to start attuning themselves to and working towards.
Ashish and Constantine, you both held positions in trying to solve the problem, as I like to say, right? You've had to try to manage these. So, what kind of techniques have companies used that have been successful or more successful in managing data privacy or the data governance aspects?
Um, I'll start. I'll say I viscerally hate Microsoft Excel because that's the thing that most compliance people are forced to work with, and it doesn't scale. It just is. So I mean, I've been involved in the technology associated with the privacy office for a number of years, and I think that's the evolution that we're starting to see, is that finally there are investments being made in this area. Because again, Outlook and Excel, while independently are wonderful programs, make the worst workflow in the world when it comes to managing privacy. And this is where I think the evolution is taking us, is and companies that are recognizing that and putting the right tools in place. And this is a partnership between privacy and information technology, because again, this is all about data governance, and good information governance yields good privacy. That if there's one message I would get across to your listeners, it would be that.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. I can totally validate what Constantine is saying. I'll give you some examples, right? Without naming names, very large Wall Street bank, have some friends there who are application managers. Some are on the foreign exchange side, some are in security. The constant theme that we hear is, I am being asked to attest to what kind of information exists in all of this data that I have, which is fast moving, changes every day, and it's my name on that spreadsheet that Constantine mentioned that is going up to the regulator saying, I only have this data and I don't, and they're saying it's hard, it's frustrating because I don't know. I'm challenged because I don't know what information day to day is changing in my environment, and God forbid if I give out the wrong information, it's my neck on the line. so 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 that's just an example of what Constantine mentioned is causing some pain, and for those, and maybe there are some in your audience who are tracking this privacy industry or privacy automation technology industry. There was this one first generation of tools that came about, which essentially tried to automate these spreadsheets and forms and surveys. Right, it was still a manual workflow of, when they said automation, they really meant, oh, we're going to automate the workflow, right? So once you fill this field out, you say submit, it goes to the next person and then to the next person. To us, that's not really automation, right? Because the hard part is doing a quick survey of all the data landscape and the state that is out there, which by the way is growing, right? Data is growing like crazy, cloud, all these macro forces are just enabling companies to store humongous amounts of information because they think it's a differentiating factor. So yeah, it's becoming harder and harder. And and as Constantine mentioned, now there is the realization, we call it the second generation, third generation of privacy automation, which is really going in and saying, okay, the biggest pain you really have is to automate the process of figuring out where this information is, what kind of information it is, who's accessing this information, where is it flowing. These are the tough questions that you need to be able to answer effectively and continuously to be able to monitor and provide that data governance that Constantine was mentioning. And so we feel that this evolution is just starting, and there are newer technologies, techniques, and it's doable because the technology evolution. We strongly believe that it's doable. This is where the force of technology should be deployed. to solve that scale problem with trying to understand where that data is.
Do you think that that's inhibited companies from a governance perspective, right? So because it's been so workflow oriented and attestation oriented as opposed to actually having hard facts about information, do you think that's delayed some of the governance?
It inhibits in a couple of ways. Number one, it seems like a big challenge, right? You're trying to eat an elephant, and to tackle doing a data inventory across the whole organization. And the problem also is in the way, again, we've typically been doing it. And that's to get, and I've worked in the big four, somebody to come in and for a huge amount of money, conduct those interviews, gather the information in spreadsheets, and then present it all to you. And that's only good at a point in time because the organization is changing so fast. To Ashish's point, it's using data in new ways almost on a weekly and monthly basis. So when you get that sort of snapshot, it's only useful at a point in time. And then you quickly, I mean, this is the whole problem that we have inherited is we knew at a point in time, but if you don't have the right technologies in place to actually monitor how things are being changing, how data is being accessed and used, new stores of data, new uses of data, then you are always going to be dealing with what I call apocrypha. You know what apocrypha are? Like they're fairy tales. It's not that the IT people want to lie to you, but they're engaged in wishful thinking. They think they know where the data is, and their view is again wishful.
Yeah, and I think the other part of this, and I have dealt with it personally, is that being part of driving the data platform and the data agenda for the company is extremely it's a pressure job. Not that others aren't, but you're always under the gun to provide data is the new fuel, right? They say the data is the new oil, right? And that is true. It's so true because if you talk to any of the data teams out there or the managers of these data teams, they are under tremendous pressure to keep those data pipelines moving so that the analysts or the data scientists are able to do their work and their job to provide that differentiation, provide that model, provide that insight so that business can make more money. And so you have this pressure on one side to keep that data flowing. But on the other side, you now also have this pressure of making sure that only the right data flows to the right places for the right purpose. And it's a very delicate balancing job that a lot of the data teams are having to do, and the pressure is only exacerbated. And so part of what one of our principles at Divebell is, we want to enable organizations to use the data. I mean, for driving their business forward. But how can we help them be responsible and better custodians of that data? I mean, data governance has all been around, just like I said, privacy has been around for a while. Data governance has also been around for a while, but for the longest time, it has almost taken a backseat. But now, with the focus on privacy and security, being in this umbrella of data governance is getting a new push to say, yeah, we are going to use this data, but we're going to do it responsibly, and we need to have the appropriate controls in place to make sure that that pipeline is moving in an appropriate manner.
It sounds like the key aspect of this complicated area, right? So as you said, Constantine, looking at the entire elephant, we have to be careful about those point in time solutions as a way to try to go after it, and maybe focus a little bit more on the data governance and the identification of information, and build up from there. Is that a fair?
Yeah, and I'll say I'm not entirely keen on the data as oil analogy because unlike oil, which may also be a little bit dated in terms of its value, is that it's imbued with rights. It is imbued with consumer or human rights, and so it is an asset to organizations, but it also has that element of rights associated with it, which is what is the pressure now to actually do data governance properly. I'll say I think one other thing about the notion of data as an asset, and I've spoken about this in the past, which is if we think of it as an asset, we don't actually treat it though like an asset. We don't know, you know, a very smart fellow once said, you know, and provided me with an analogy I like to use. If you imagine you have a fleet of buses, you know where the buses are, you know who's driving them, you know their depreciated value, you know their maintenance schedule, and you know when they're due to be retired, and you know that they're behind a fence locked up at night. We don't think still of data that way. We still haven't matured to the notion of data really being treated as an asset. And I think that one of the opportunities for technology is not only to enable rich uses of data in a manner that is compliant with the law, compliant with this notion of it being imbued with human rights, but it also liberates organizations to be able to be better stewards of that information and use it more richly because they have greater confidence. We do observe something called data reticence, which is the fear of using data because you're not sure of the rules. You're not sure you've got it with the right consents or what kind of rules might be associated with how you've gotten the data. And that I think is also becoming a major inhibition to this data driven economy.
Really interesting points. I like the analogy, because you don't want your bus driver texting while driving either, right? All the consumer rights that are there as a passenger in the bus are another twist of the analogy.
There are so many ways you can use the bus analogy.
It's very nice. So Ashish, maybe so let's go to those second, third generation tools like Divebell. So what is the difference, or what's we have on one spectrum the evil of doing this in Excel. We have on the other spectrum, magic. Where are we seeing with Divebell?
Yeah. So going back to what I was saying earlier, it's 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 the ability to deploy what we call sensors. There might be other terminologies. The ability to deploy this technology in a lightweight fashion to be able to do that survey in an automated fashion. Now it's easier said than done because you want to make sure that you're not, whatever you're scanning, you're not bringing the whole thing down when you're scanning every single row in there. Obviously, there's a lot of hesitance for doing that because these are sometimes production systems, oftentimes production systems. And so companies are rightly worried, hey, you're scanning my whole thing, what's going to happen to my business, right? So that's a concern. The other concern is the data that any of these technologies are scanning should stay within the perimeter, should stay within the boundaries of the organization, because if you're going to be sending this data out, obviously that's against what you're trying to do. So you have to keep that data secure and safe. Thirdly, there are also challenges from what is called false positives. And if there are any security officers or privacy officers in your audience, they will know what I'm talking about. This industry has been plagued with this curse of false positives. Without going into too many details or nitty gritties, when you are trying to find out what kind of information exists, there's always that accuracy problem of you may call something a phone number might be classified, if the format is different, it might be classified as some other proprietary identifier you might have. So there's always this issue of flood of false positives coming where you don't know whether what the system is telling you is accurate or not. So that is also a problem that has plagued the industry. So we have looked at Divebell, we have looked at all these various problems and said, how can we build this lightweight SaaS-like experience for companies to be able to deploy this technology so you can solve for, I just mentioned three, there are many other aspects of being able to very in a lightweight fashion, be able to scan these data environments, and we use statistically valid sampling techniques to do that, so that you don't really have to go scan every single row, and we can, with some good degree of confidence, say what kind of information exists. Number one. Number two, we have built a SaaS-like experience without that data ever leaving the company's premises. So it is a architectural uh, technique that we have used to be able to do that, so that the data stays secure in a customer's environment. And then thirdly, we pride ourselves in a lot of investment that we have put into very accurate detection techniques and classification techniques. And I have a couple of co-founders, and we are deep into data security and data classification. We've done this before in the DLP space. So my co-founders were basically at a company called Wantu, which was acquired by Symantec, and they coined the term data loss prevention (DLP). So we've seen how how this thing can go sideways very quickly if not done appropriately and in the right fashion. So all of this has been sort of we've tried to, of course we're just getting started, right? There's a lot more to do, but we feel that this is the foundation for a company that has any significant amount of data to be able to deploy this technology and start helping those users to figure out all those things about how much data, what kind, who's accessing it, and things like that. Well, one other thing I'll quickly state that just came to my mind is that it's not just enough to look at databases. Databases obviously have a lot of information, but you also have to look at, these days, you have to look at Google Drives. You have to look at SharePoints. You have to look at even Slack, right? A lot of collaboration tools also are capturing a lot of sensitive and private information. So it's not just enough to point something at your database and say, I'm covered. Your surface area is much broader than just databases. You also need the ability to be able to look at these other repositories as well. So yeah, those are some of the things that come to my mind.
And that's another fun piece of this, is that the universe is expanding pretty rapidly from a data perspective, right? So and back to the theme. The theme is that this information is a consumer's human right type of information, and so being able to track those things across there is very important. And you've both had interactions with the compliance teams, or have been in the compliance team in the past. So, what would be the optimum way? And at CastleHill, we're a GRC focused company, right? So that governance aspect of this, what would be the ideal way to integrate, a tool like Divebell and specifically into that compliance program, right? How do we get away from the Excel spreadsheets and workflow?
I'll talk about what's worked for me. I mean, and it's I was the one expressing the business need to support InfoSec or IT to make the investments. Sadly, privacy officers don't get a lot of budget. So, and I actually put out a query to my audience through LinkedIn asking, what's your relationship with IT, just to see, how is that working? Because that's become critical now. And half say we're like brothers or sisters from another mother, and half say, sometimes we talk. So I think that's the issue: is can we? And I would say I'm pleased to say I've been successful in that partnership. It is vitally important that the privacy office, which often is lawyers, as I am, understand enough about technology to be able to support the people who are actually going to have to implement this, actually have to approve this, to recognize the requirements. We can establish what the business driver is, which is the law, which is consumers, but it's ultimately got to be that partnership. This is a multidisciplinary game.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with that. And I think one of the things that, in fact, we are having conversations with some GRC vendors, and Tim, you are an expert in this field as well. A couple of areas we have found interesting and we are starting to make progress in is, first of all, Divebell is all API driven. So everything, all of the information and insights that we capture are all available via APIs. So that's always very interesting because every large enterprise has a whole bunch of tools, and you don't want they don't want users going to 10 different screens to get this information, that information. So that facilitates integration. That's number one. Number two, as far as my understanding goes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the governance or GRC tools, they are great at regulations and documenting what the regulations are, what the policies should be. Where they might have slight challenge is, well, what are the controls that are making sure that, and the controls might also be documented, in a paper fashion and authenticated and approved by the organization. But how do you know that the control is actually working? And is it really operational? You're claiming to do this, you're claiming to monitor access, you're claiming to say that this data only exists in this place and nowhere else, and that's our policy. But do you really know that? And so that's the other area that we have within Divebell, and we recognize this because the power of Divebell is because we are able to look at all these various places in the enterprise. We are able to provide that validation that yes, the control that you established, first of all, we can implement it. So one thing I didn't talk about was we have a policy engine. It's like a rules engine. Very simply, it's a rules engine, and you can tell it what is okay and what is not okay. That this data should exist here, it shouldn't exist. Should this person or these roles have access to this information, or they shouldn't, and so on and so forth. So you can define a whole bunch of different rules around how this data should be shaped and stay in your organization. So that's a way to implement those controls, and make sure that you get notified if there's some deviation from the baseline. So in Divewell, we talk about establishing a baseline, a topic for another day, I guess. But we have a way that we tell our customers to start to implement Divewell, because it can be a journey. You can't just you have to go step by step, area by area, department by department. So we help our customers kind of adopt the Divewell platform. And then lastly, I will say from a GRC standpoint, one of the interesting things is we have a risk scoring algorithm. So what we do is it takes into account multiple different factors, like how much data, how sensitive, where is it, what geography, how many users are accessing it. So there are a bunch of different dimensions or factors that go into calculating what a risk score is for a data sitting in a specific repository. And this risk score is a great way, we feel, to track how you're doing in terms of managing that risk that might be there because of your sensitive data being in a certain location and so on and so forth. So we have some visualizations that can help management teams ensure that they're making progress, that the trend lines are right, they're doing the right things. And of course, this risk score is also available as an API. So we are talking to some GRC partners to be able to source that risk score, because that's a very interesting, just from a very tactical standpoint, very interesting tidbit or insight in terms of managing the GRC, at least from managing a GRC program, at least from a privacy standpoint. So, and these are early days, I'm sure, and we have, every conversation we have, we find synergies. So that's kind of where we are starting, but I'm sure there's a lot more that we'll get to in the future.
Ashish touched on one thing I'm going to just draw some attention to, and that's the proving it part. Like the best summary I've seen about compliance with GDPR or really any privacy law, I wish I'd come up with it. Do what you say what you do, be able to prove it. It's that being able to prove it part that's really the change in legislation and expectations. How do you prove you're doing what you claim you're doing? We've had a world where everyone just threw privacy notices up. These assertions were never capable of being proven. Now the expectation is you will be able to stand behind the statements you make.
And the financial or even legal impact of those things has now been dramatically changed.
With the opportunity, I mean, always used to say to my European friends, who'd say Americans don't care about privacy. You haven't met their lawyers. It's like, there's now increasingly conversation about, rights of action, statutory damages. And that's a lot of the reason that some of the laws have been held up, is that debate. But one way or the other, there is going to be those class actions coming. So that's another huge driver for doing the right thing, and making that effort. Because inevitably one of these is going to catch fire, and it's going to be, if data is the new oil, that's what you don't want catching fire.
Absolutely. Anything else to add, gentlemen?
Constantine's train of thought. I'll just maybe give one other example.
It's not a train, it's a bus.
That's right. That's right. At a prior company that I worked at, there was talking about how important this issue has become. We were trying to get this contract in place with this big health insurance company. and we were providing a service, and they essentially, basically, we went through all the certifications, answering the questionnaires, making sure we show them our architecture, all those things. The last part was this very same topic. So we claimed in our proposal that we have all these things in place, we do all these good things, we take care of customer data. Their chief privacy officer, had a call with us and basically asked this exact same question. We have our patient information sitting in your SaaS estate. You're claiming to do all these things. Prove it. How do I know you're doing it? And I want to see how your controls are, how you're deploying those controls, and I want to see on a monthly basis, some kind of a report that tells me that our data is secure. So, so it led to actually 3.5, 4 weeks of negotiation, at the end of which we actually had to build a mini Divebell to prove that we actually have controls in place, and we started sending them this report, and which is when that actually contract went through. So that was a realization to me that it's come home. It's become real that this concern is really impacting companies both small and large.
Magnify that times the hundreds or thousands of vendors that company is interacting with, and it comes back to the argument about getting this into a GRC tool through effective integration and actually having the governance processes built in place.
Exactly.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and excellent topic and excellent insights from both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was fun.
I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. For more episodes, insights, and discussion, check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or at our website, www.castlehillrisk.com. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll see you next time on a Coffee Chat with CastleHill.